The office was quiet save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Gunnar sat behind his desk, his remaining eye trained on the paperwork in front of him, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the battles that had been fought and the ones still to come. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps and the door creaking open. Derren strolled in, casual as always, wearing that ever-present smirk that Gunnar had grown used to over the years. Without waiting for an invitation, Derren hopped up to sit on the edge of Gunnar's desk, grinning like he had a secret. "You busy, boss man?" Derren asked, kicking his legs slightly as he leaned in closer. Gunnar glanced up, one eyebrow raised. "I'm guessing you've got something on your mind, Derren. What is it this time?" Derren's smirk widened. "You remember any of the pre-deployment training we did at the National Training Center? NTC? Or how about JRTC? Gunnar leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, the war games. Those were some good times." Derren nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. War games. I was just talking with my old buddy, Sergeant Major Kick. He's still running things at the training facilities. We got to reminiscing, and it got me thinking." Gunnar narrowed his eye, sensing what was coming. "I'm listening." Derren straightened, his grin taking on a competitive edge. "How about a good old-fashioned war game? Just like the old days. My team versus yours. We've been sitting on our hands too long. It's time to shake the dust off." Gunnar chuckled, shaking his head. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Derren replied, hopping off the desk. 7 days of all-out war games at NTC, with our teams going head-to-head. We've got the supernatural twist this time, of course, but the basics are the same." Gunnar folded his arms across his chest, studying Derren carefully. "And what's the point of this challenge?" Derren shrugged, but there was a spark in his eyes. "Prove you're still the top dog, Gunnar. You, me, and our teams. No holding back. Just like we used to do." There was a long pause as Gunnar considered the proposal. The old days of training had been intense, physically and mentally, and while he had always been the leader, the idea of going head-to-head with Derren, a man who knew how to get under his skin, sparked something inside him. "All right," Gunnar finally said, leaning forward. "You've got yourself a war game, but don't think for a second that I'm going to make it easy for you." Derren's grin widened. Wouldn't have it any other way. He clapped his hands together, clearly thrilled that Gunnar had taken the bait. "So, here's the deal. We start in 1 week, 7 days of war games at NTC. I'm taking Eli, Clara, and Omega on my team. I don't think that Wolf likes me much, but we'll figure it out. Ileana's going to be our referee, keep things fair, and Jules there for medical support, just in case someone decides to get a little too competitive." Gunnar raised an eyebrow. "And my team?" "You've got Alpha, Beta, and you can choose 2 others from the pack, but pick wisely. I'm not planning to go easy on you." Gunnar smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "Don't worry about me, Derren. I'll pick the best." Derren paced back and forth in front of the desk, his mind already racing ahead. "Oh, and one more thing. Sergeant Major Kick's going to make sure we've got the latest training gear. You'll get your kit tomorrow. Energy-based weapons that fire non-lethal rounds, but trust me, they hurt like hell when you're hit." Gunnar stood, the air between them charged with a new kind of intensity. "I hope you're ready to lose, Derren." Derren just laughed. "I think you're the one who needs to prepare for that." As he turned to leave the room, Derren paused at the door, throwing one last challenge over his shoulder. "Game starts on Monday. Get your team ready, Gunnar. You've got 7 days." The team prepares. Later that day, Gunnar stood before his chosen team in the main room of the workshop. Alpha and Beta, his 2 loyal wolves, sat at his feet, their golden eyes fixed on him. Desera leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, while Karina stood beside her, ready and focused. "We've got 1 week before we head to NTC for war games," Gunnar began, his voice steady. "Derren's going to hit us hard, and I need each of you at your best. This isn't just a training exercise. It's a test. Derren smirked, cracking her knuckles. Derren's team might be tough, but they've got nothing on us. Karina nodded, already thinking tactically. What's the plan, Gunner? We start with team-building drills, Gunner explained. Then we'll focus on offensive and defensive strategies. Derren's team is strong. Eli's got the tech advantage. Clara's got tactics. And Omega. We can't underestimate them. Derren straightened up. You think we've got a shot? Gunner's gaze hardened. We're not just fighting for bragging rights. Derren challenged us because he thinks he can outsmart us. I'm not letting that happen. He looked down at Alpha and Beta. The wolves had been through countless battles by his side, and he trusted them more than anyone. They wouldn't let him down. We've got 1 week to get ready, Gunner said. Let's make it count. Derren's team. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Derren gathered his own team at a remote location in the countryside. Eli, Clara, and Omega stood before him as the wind whipped through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and foliage. We've got 1 week to train, Derren said, his voice all business now. Gunner's going to come at us with everything he's got, and we need to be ready. Clara nodded, her tactical mind already working. What's the plan? Eli, I need you working on the tech, surveillance, comms, anything that can give us an edge. Clara, you're handling strategy. I want us outsmarting Gunner at every turn. Eli gave a determined nod. Got it! And Omega, Derren added, turning to the massive wolf standing beside Clara. You and I need to work on communication. I need to make sure we're on the same page. Omega growled softly and Clara chuckled. He'll be fine, as long as you don't do anything stupid. Derren grinned. No promises. The team got to work, training hard and pushing themselves to the limit. They knew that when the time came, Gunner's team would bring everything they had. But Derren was confident in his team's ability to rise to the challenge. The countdown begins. As the week passed, both teams trained relentlessly. They knew that the upcoming war games wouldn't be just a test of strength, but of strategy, coordination, and trust. The day before the game, Gunner received the operations order. The details of the war game were laid out clearly: rules, objectives, and the boundaries of the training area. As he read through the document, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Derren had gone all out on this one. Monday morning would bring the start of something neither team would forget, a test of skill, loyalty, and willpower. And when it was over, only one team would stand victorious. As the final hours ticked by, the air was filled with anticipation. Both teams were ready. The stage was set. Let the games begin. The air in the hangar was filled with the low hum of machinery and the distant echo of voices. Derren led his team toward the far end of the cavernous space, a mischievous grin plastered on his face as he gestured for Eli, Clara, and Omega to follow. The hangar lights glinted off the sleek black C-130 cargo plane parked near the entrance, but that wasn't the only thing that caught the team's attention. All right, team, I've got something special to show you before we head out, Derren said, his voice carrying a note of excitement. Eli raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What did you do, Derren? With a flourish, Derren threw open the doors to a side hangar, revealing a vehicle unlike anything they had seen before. Sitting in the center of the room was a UTV, a hybrid machine that gleamed under the lights. It looked like a cross between a futuristic war machine and something out of a cartoon, complete with exaggerated wolf ears on the roof and a large tail mounted at the back. But the real show was in the details. The UTV was a hybrid model, capable of switching between electric and gas-powered modes, and it seated 3, a driver and a passenger in the front, with a third seat mounted in the middle for a gunner. The passenger side was equipped with a mounted machine gun, rigged with a training receiver that would fire non-lethal energy rounds for the upcoming war games. And at the back, the gunner's turret featured a minigun capable of spitting out 1,000 training rounds per minute. On either side of the turret, bench seats were securely fastened, clearly designed for Omega and the wolves to ride in. The vehicle looked like a beast designed for combat, and yet Derren couldn't resist his personal touch. Those wolf ears and tail stood out in comical contrast to the rest of the machine. "I present to you," Derren said dramatically, "the new and improved Wolfmobile." Eli blinked, trying to process what she was seeing. "You really went all out, didn't you?" Clara crossed her arms, a slight smirk forming on her lips as she inspected the machine. "I'm not sure whether to be impressed or worried." Derren grinned proudly. "Impressed, definitely. This bad boy is a hybrid, runs on both electric and gas, so we're good on speed and silence, perfect for getting in and out without drawing too much attention. And, of course, the turret and machine gun are equipped with the training receivers so we can light up the battlefield without taking out the other team. Unfortunately." Omega padded forward and sniffed at the bench seats on either side of the turret. He let out a soft growl, his golden eyes narrowing as if evaluating the contraption. Derren knelt down beside the wolf, patting one of the benches. "Don't worry, big guy, these are secure. You'll be riding in style. I made sure of it." Clara gave Derren an appraising look. "All right, you've outdone yourself this time. But are you sure this thing will handle the terrain at NTC?" Derren stood up, his grin never faltering. "Oh, it'll handle anything NTC throws at us. Trust me. We'll be moving like shadows. Well, shadows with a lot of firepower." Eli walked around the vehicle, inspecting the mounted guns and the turret. "And the machine guns? Non-lethal?" Derren nodded. "All energy-based rounds, so they'll sting like hell, but nobody's dying on my watch. It's all about the pain without the permanence." Eli raised an eyebrow, giving him a sideways look. "You really thought this through?" Derren gave a mock bow. "I try." Just as the group started to admire the Wolfmobile from different angles, Derren turned to the large black C-130 cargo plane, parked nearby. The sleek matte black aircraft loomed over them, its engines silent, but filled with the promise of power. "And that, my friends, is our ride to NTC," Derren announced, motioning to the aircraft. "Got in touch with some old friends and borrowed this beauty. We'll be making a tactical insertion once we get to NTC." "Tactical insertion?" Clara asked, a note of skepticism in her voice. "You mean—" Derren's grin grew wider. "That's right, a good old-fashioned parachute drop. We'll be flying in low and jumping out before dawn. Perfect way to make an entrance, don't you think?" Omega growled softly, pacing around the Wolfmobile as if sensing the coming challenge. Clara exchanged a glance with the massive wolf, her lips curving into a smile. "Omega and I have done worse." Eli crossed her arms, her brow furrowed in thought. "And the gear?" "Already packed," Derren replied. "Everything we need for the week is loaded in the plane, including the training kit. You'll get the operational order tonight, and we hit the ground running at dawn." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the team. "So, who's scared of heights? 'Cause if you are, now's the time to speak up." Eli, always composed, rolled her eyes. "You know heights don't bother me." Clara cracked her knuckles, stepping forward. "Neither of us have a problem with heights, Derren." Derren smirked. "Good. Just wanted to make sure everyone's ready to fly. 'Cause when that door opens tomorrow, we're jumping out at 1,200 feet, and there's no going back." The atmosphere in the hangar shifted, the playful banter giving way to a sharper focus. Everyone understood that the war games would push them to their limits, physically, mentally, and strategically. This wasn't just about training, it was about testing their cohesion as a unit, their ability to adapt and survive under pressure. Eli glanced at the C-130, then at the Wolfmobile. "Derren, you've certainly raised the stakes." Derren laughed. "That's the idea. This is gonna be fun." Clara, always the pragmatic one, leaned against the vehicle, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Fun? Maybe, but I'm more interested in winning." "We will," Derren said confidently. "I've got a plan, and with this setup, Gunner's not going to know what hit him." Omega growled in agreement, and for a moment, the group shared a rare, unified smile. The final countdown. Later that evening, as the team gathered for final preparations, Derren handed out the operational orders. The plan was simple but tactical. They'd parachute into NTC under cover of darkness and head straight for their starting point in the war games. Gunner's team would be doing the same, but Derren had a few surprises up his sleeve. Chief among them, the Wolfmobile and the unspoken advantages it provided in terms of mobility and firepower. As Derren briefed the team, Eli's mind raced with calculations about the tech she'd rig up to give them an edge, while Clara went over potential strategies, mentally mapping the terrain they'd be navigating. The anticipation was palpable. Tomorrow they'd take to the skies, drop into enemy territory, and engage in a week of battle where every decision could be the difference between victory and defeat. The anticipation buzzed through the air like electricity as Derren gathered his team in the dimly lit hangar, the low hum of the C-130's engines reverberating through the walls. It wasn't just any war game, it was a showdown of pride, honor, and bragging rights. This wasn't about life or death, but something deeper, something personal. Derren, leaning casually against the rugged frame of the Wolfmobile, grinned at his team. "All right, everyone, who's afraid of heights?" He raised an eyebrow, his smirk teasing. Eli, standing at his side, looked up at the towering plane before them. Her face was serious, her sharp eyes taking in the strange, mechanical bird with a mix of wariness and curiosity. "I've spent most of my life in the forests and open plains of Alfheim. This," she gestured toward the plane, "isn't natural." Derren chuckled, his voice light. "Don't worry, Keebler. By the time you hit the ground, you'll think it's the most exhilarating thing ever." Clara, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, threw a playful jab. "That is, if you don't puke mid-air." Eli shot Clara a sharp look, her elven pride refusing to show weakness. "I've faced worse than falling from the sky. Just explain how this works." Derren stood straighter, giving the black C-130 a fond look. "This bird is how we're getting into the game. We'll be making a tactical parachute insertion. You've got your parachutes, harnesses, and," he pointed toward Omega, pacing in the background, his fur bristling. "Even the wolves have their own setup." Eli frowned as she glanced at Omega. The large, half-dire, half-grey wolf seemed uneasy, growling low at the sound of the engines. "He's not going to like this." "Relax," Derren said, waving it off. "Omega's tough. Once he's in the air, he'll love it." Omega growled again, but Eli wasn't convinced. She knelt next to him, calming him with a gentle hand. "Easy now. We'll be fine." The jump. Tactical parachuting. The C-130 roared down the runway and took to the skies, climbing higher and higher into the thin air. Inside, Derren's team strapped themselves in, the anticipation building as the mission briefing played in their minds. Eli sat rigid, her eyes darting toward the cargo door that would soon open to drop them into the desert below. The hum of the plane was unsettling, the confined space foreign to her elven instincts. Clara, already suited up, smirked from across the cabin. "You ready to fly, Keebler?" Eli narrowed her eyes, her hands tightening on the straps of her harness. "Ready as I'll ever be." The red light over the door blinked on, a signal that they were approaching the drop zone. Derren stood up, adjusting his own chute, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "All right, team. Let's make this count." The jump door hissed open, revealing the vast desert landscape far below. The wind rushed inside, howling as it filled the cabin. Omega's ears flattened against his head, clearly agitated by the sudden rush of air. His wolfish instincts were fighting against the unnatural situation, but Derren had equipped him with a specially designed harness, one he'd tested himself. Derren gave Omega a quick scratch behind the ears. "Ready, boy? This is going to be wild." The green light blinked on, signaling the go. Derren didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear, strapped Omega securely beside him, and jumped. The others followed. Clara was next, leaping effortlessly into the sky, her battle-hardened face showing no fear. "Race you down!" she yelled into the wind. Eli, heart pounding in her chest, stepped up to the edge. She hesitated for only a second, taking in the wide open sky. This was completely unlike anything she had ever experienced, but she wasn't about to let her pride be questioned. With a steadying breath, she leaped into the void. The sensation of free-falling through the sky was jarring at first, an alien experience to an elf who was used to running on solid ground or navigating the treetops of Alfheim. But after a few seconds, Eli adjusted, focusing on her landing point. The ground rushed up to meet them, and her parachute deployed smoothly. She landed lightly, her elven agility aiding her in sticking the landing. Clara hit the ground beside her, giving her a quick smirk. "Not bad for your first time." Eli straightened up, brushing off her jump. "Not bad for an Earthborn." Derren touched down next, landing with Omega, who shook off the experience with a growl of discontent. "Told you it was fun," Derren said with a grin as he checked Omega's gear. The Wolfmobile dropped nearby, landing with a mechanical thud as its parachutes deployed. Derren wasted no time getting his team geared up and loaded onto the vehicle. Eli took the front passenger seat, where the mounted energy-firing machine gun gleamed, while Clara climbed into the turret, her hands resting on the grips of the minigun. Derren revved the engine. "Everyone ready? Let's show Gunner's team what real speed looks like." With a roar, the Wolfmobile surged forward, kicking up dust as they sped toward the objective, Gunner's insertion and delays. Across the desert, Gunner and his team soared through the skies in the black jet. Sleek and fast, it carved through the air like a shadow. Inside, Gunner was focused, his eyes on the mission ahead. They were up against Derren's team, and while it was all in good fun, the competitive fire burned in his chest. Karina sat across from him, checking her blades. "Derren's probably already on the ground, setting up his traps." "We'll see about that," Gunner replied. "He won't have the advantage for long." Desiree adjusted her gear, looking at the electric dirt bikes stowed behind them. "The bikes will get us there fast, but the wolves, they'll slow us down." "They'll manage," Gunner said, glancing at Alpha and Beta, who were pacing restlessly in the back. "They've kept pace before." The jet banked smoothly, descending toward the insertion point. When the ramp opened, the air outside rushed in, hot and dry. Gunner led the team out, dismounting the jet and unloading the electric bikes. They mounted the bikes and tore off across the desert, the smooth hum of the electric engines barely audible over the wind. Alpha and Beta sprinted beside them, their powerful legs keeping up for the first few miles. But as the terrain grew rougher, the wolves began to tire, forcing Gunner's team to slow down. Desiree cursed under her breath. "Derren's already ahead of us." "Keep moving," Gunner growled. "We'll catch him." But the delay was clear. They were falling behind, and they all knew it. The ambush. Derren's trap. Derren's team arrived at the outpost far ahead of schedule, parking the Wolfmobile in a concealed position near the ridge. Derren surveyed the area, his mind working through their tactical options. "All right, Eli, get the traps ready. Clara, find a high point to cover the field. We'll hit Gunner's team the moment they enter the ravine." Eli moved quickly, setting up a series of energy snares, trip mines, and holographic decoys that would confuse and disorient Gunner's team. Clara climbed the ridge, positioning herself behind the turret of the Wolfmobile, her finger twitching on the trigger. "Gunner's gonna regret challenging us," Derren muttered to himself, grinning as he took up position. Gunner's arrival, the fight begins. Hours later, Gunner's team reached the ravine, moving cautiously. There was a tension in the air, the kind that only came before an ambush. "Something's not right," Gunner muttered, slowing his bike. "Stay alert." As they entered the ravine, Derren's trap was sprung. The Wolfmobile's turret roared to life, spewing energy rounds that tore into the rocky terrain. Ashley barely had time to react before a barrage of shots hit her vest, signaling her elimination. "Down!" Gunner barked as the team scrambled for cover. Alpha and Beta were quick to respond, but they couldn't avoid the concentrated fire. Beta's vest lit up next, signaling his defeat. "Beta's out!" Desiree called, diving behind a rock. Keep moving, Gunnar ordered, his mind racing for a way out. But Derren's team had the high ground and the advantage. Karina tried to slip through the shadows, blades drawn as she stalked toward Derren. She moved silently, but Derren was ready. Really, Karina? A knife? You brought a knife to a gunfight? Before she could react, one of Eli's traps went off, disorienting her. Her vest flared and she was out. The wolves' battle, Alpha versus Omega. Nearby, Alpha and Omega squared off in a brutal battle. The two wolves clashed with snarls and growls, each trying to assert dominance. Omega, faster and more agile, danced around Alpha's brute force, but Alpha's experience gave him the edge. In the end, after a long, fierce battle, Omega submitted to his father, acknowledging Alpha's superiority. Desera's shot, and the final showdown. Desera, ever the sniper, took advantage of the chaos. From her concealed position, she lined up her shot, taking aim at Derren. With one well-placed shot, she hit him square in the chest, knocking him out of the fight. Nice shot, Gunnar muttered as he slid into cover beside her. But Eli wasn't done yet. Using one of her gadgets, she projected a holographic decoy of herself, confusing Desera. While Desera focused on the illusion, Eli moved in from behind, taking the sniper out in a surprise counterattack. "Eliana, call it!" Eli shouted, knowing she had been hit at the same time as Desera. Eliana's voice crackled over the comms. "Both Eli and Desera are out." The final face-off, Gunnar versus Clara. With most of the teams eliminated, it came down to Gunnar and Clara. The two alphas, both tactical geniuses in their own right, squared off across the battlefield. Clara knew she couldn't match Gunnar's brute strength, so she relied on her speed and agility, darting in and out of cover, hitting him with quick, precise shots before disappearing into the shadows. But Gunnar wasn't about to go down easily. He pushed forward, muscling through her attacks, absorbing the hits while closing the distance between them. Clara circled around, trying to get the upper hand, but Gunnar was relentless. Finally, with a well-timed maneuver, he caught her off guard, firing a final shot that hit her vest square in the back. "Eliana?" Gunnar called out, breathing heavily. "Gunnar wins!" Eliana declared, her voice echoing through the ravine. Aftermath, joking and debriefing, both teams regrouped at the outpost, laughing and trading jabs about the fight. Clara gave Gunnar a playful shove. "Next time, old man." Derren, despite being eliminated early, couldn't help but grin. Okay, I'll admit the Wolfmobile gave us an unfair advantage. But hey, it's still impressive, right? Gunnar shook his head with a smirk. "I'll give you that much. The Wolfmobile was something else." As the banter continued, it was clear the war game had been a success, even if only one team could claim victory. The beeping of the tablets pulled both teams from their post-war game banter. Derren, still grinning from the earlier match, glanced down at his screen. "All right, looks like it's time to pack up and head to our campsites. Hope everyone brought their tents and bug spray." Eli, sitting beside Omega, raised an eyebrow. "What is bug spray?" Derren smirked. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough, Keebler." Gunnar's team checked their own tablets, and Gunnar grunted as he stood up, his new arm flexing slightly as he adjusted it. "All right, let's move out. Looks like we've got our next challenge starting tomorrow morning." As the teams split up, Derren made one last jab at Gunnar. "Don't get too comfortable, old man. I'm still not done with you." Gunnar smirked. "You better be ready for tomorrow, Derren. You're going to need more than a fancy Wolfmobile to win this one." Nightfall. Scouts in the shadows. The campsites were located on opposite sides of the sprawling training grounds, deep in the rugged terrain. Derren's team reached theirs just before dusk, the sun casting long shadows across the desert as they began to set up camp. Omega, still clearly irritated from the earlier parachute experience, paced around the perimeter, his growls low and constant. Every now and then, his gaze would settle on Derren, and the tension between them was palpable. "You know," Derren said, eyeing the wolf warily as he pitched his tent, "I think Omega might actually try to eat me in my sleep." Eli, adjusting her own tent with elven precision, shot him a glance. He doesn't like being forced into things he didn't choose. He's not like the others. Derren snorted, keeping a careful distance from Omega. Yeah, well, I didn't exactly enjoy being strapped to him during the jump either. Clara, finishing her setup with practiced ease, gave a small chuckle from her spot near the fire pit. Maybe if you stop calling him Furball, he'll warm up to you. Derren grumbled but didn't respond. He had a feeling the tension between him and Omega wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Meanwhile, on the other side of the training grounds, Gunner's team was settling in. Karina, always stealthy and methodical, scouted the perimeter, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of activity. Desiree had taken the lead on setting up the campfire, her military background evident in how quickly and efficiently she worked. Gunner, however, was finding it more difficult to handle the smaller tasks with his new arm. As he struggled to set up his own tent, the fabric slipping out of his mechanical grasp, Karina approached. "You need help?" she asked, not unkindly. Gunner grimaced but nodded, still getting used to it. Karina knelt down and made quick work of the setup. "Don't worry about it, that's what the team's for." As they worked in silence, the shadows around the camp seemed to deepen, the desert growing quieter. Unbeknownst to either team, the NTC Training Op 4, the opposition forces were already on the move, silently scouting both camps from a distance. They moved like ghosts through the night, observing every detail, every weakness. Tomorrow's challenge wasn't just about teamwork. It was also about avoiding the watchful eyes of their hidden opponents. Morning. The obstacle course. The next morning, as the sun rose over the desert, both teams received their new assignment on their tablets. The screen blinked with the location of the new challenge, a massive team-building course filled with towering walls, wide ravines, and narrow pathways with out-of-bounds zones on either side. Each team would be given an 80-pound crate, and their task was to move it through the course without crossing into any out-of-bounds areas. The penalty? Elimination. Derren's team arrived at the course first, the Wolfmobile once again giving them a slight advantage in speed. They parked it just outside the starting zone, and Derren grinned as he looked over the expanse of the course. "Well, this should be fun," he said, eyeing the tall walls and wide ravines. Eli, who had been inspecting the crate, raised an eyebrow. "How are we supposed to carry this through all of that?" "We're not carrying it," Derren replied, his grin widening. "We're going to get creative." And Omega stood nearby, watching silently. Omega growled, his eyes narrowing at Derren as if he knew what was coming. "Relax, Furball," Derren said, patting the wolf on the head before quickly pulling his hand away. "We'll be fine." Clara. Meanwhile, Gunner's team arrived at the course on their electric dirt bikes. As they dismounted, they quickly assessed the challenge ahead. Gunner's face was serious as he looked over the towering obstacles. "This isn't going to be easy," he muttered. His mechanical arm twitched slightly as he flexed it, the weight of the challenge pressing down on him. Desiree, ever the strategist, nodded. "We'll have to work together on this. That crate is going to slow us down." The challenge begins. The teams lined up at their respective starting points, each one staring down the long stretch of desert terrain. The outpost lay ahead in the distance, but between them and their goal were towering walls, narrow ravines, and obstacles designed to test their teamwork. Derren's team moved first, hoisting the crate onto the Wolfmobile. The vehicle's sturdy frame and strong suspension allowed it to carry the weight with ease, and Derren grinned as they began to move through the course. "This is almost too easy," he muttered to Clara, who was manning the turret, keeping an eye on the surroundings. But Eli wasn't so sure. "The obstacles will get tougher. We should be prepared." Gunner's team, meanwhile, had to rely on their combined strength to move the crate. Gunner, normally the one to shoulder the heaviest loads, was struggling to keep his mechanical arm steady. Every time he tried to grab hold of the crate, it slipped, and the frustration was clear on his face. "Let me take the lead," Desiree said, stepping in. "You handle the navigation." Gunner didn't argue. He knew his limitations and trusted his team. They worked together, slowly maneuvering the crate over the first set of obstacles. The ravine was the first real test, its jagged walls steep and unforgiving. Karina, with her agility and balance, managed to cross first, setting up a rope system for the others. As they worked, the tension between the two teams was palpable. Both knew that one misstep could mean the difference between victory and defeat, the ravine and the ambush. As Derren's team approached the ravine, Omega growled, sensing something off. He paced restlessly, his eyes scanning the rocks below. "What is it, boy?" Derren asked, glancing down into the ravine. Before he could react, one of the NTC OpForce scouts revealed themselves, firing a few non-lethal rounds toward them. The shots hit the rocks around them, missing but sending a clear message. They were being watched. Clara quickly spun the turret, firing back with a spray of energy rounds. The OpFor retreated, disappearing into the desert. "Looks like we're not alone out here," she muttered. Derren grinned. "Good. I was starting to get bored." They managed to get the crate across the ravine using a combination of brute force and the Wolfmobile's winch system. But Omega's constant growls made it clear the OP4 scouts were still out there, watching their every move. The final wall. Gunnar versus Derren. As both teams neared the final obstacle, a towering wall that required them to work together to lift the crate over, Gunnar's team began to close the gap. The Wolfmobile was fast, but the obstacles had slowed Derren's team down, enough for Gunnar's team to catch up. Gunnar, his arm still struggling with the weight, looked over at the wall. "We're going to have to use everything we've got to get this thing over." Derren, Karina, and the others moved quickly, setting up ropes and securing the crate. But as they started to lift it, Derren's voice echoed across the field. "Need some help, old man?" Gunnar looked up to see Derren's team already halfway up the wall, using the Wolfmobile's winch to hoist their crate. "I've got this," Gunnar growled, pushing forward despite the strain on his arm. But it was no use. His arm wasn't cooperating, and for the first time, Gunnar had to rely entirely on his team. With Derren's leadership and Karina's quick thinking, they managed to get the crate to the top just as Derren's team crossed the finish line. Debriefing, jokes and lessons learned. Both teams gathered at the end of the course, breathing heavily but grinning. Derren slapped Gunnar on the back. "Not bad, old man. You almost had us there." Gunnar smirked, though there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Next time, Derren." The Wolfmobile sat nearby, its large wolf ears and tail swaying in the desert breeze. Clara and Omega both looked at it with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "I still can't believe you actually built that thing," Gunnar muttered, shaking his head. Derren grinned. "Hey, it worked, didn't it?" As they all laughed and exchanged stories about the day's challenges, Eliana stepped forward to give her judgment. Both teams showed exceptional skill, but I have to say, Derren's team had the edge with their creative use of transportation. Gunnar groaned. "All right, fine. You win this round." But deep down, both teams knew the real victory was in how they had come together. They were stronger, more united, and ready for whatever came next. The sun had set by the time both teams finally gathered around the campfire. After the grueling obstacle course and close competition, the air was filled with a sense of camaraderie, even if some friendly rivalry still lingered. They sat on the ground, digging into their meals ready to eat, MREs, provided by the NTC training base. Derren, ever the joker, held up his pack and inspected the label. "Great, more chicken with mystery sauce," Derren said, tearing into the package with an exaggerated sigh. "Can't they give us something other than these delicacies for once?" Eli, seated across from him, poked at her own meal with a mix of confusion and mild disgust. "This isn't food, is it?" Derren chuckled. "Keebler, you've still got a lot to learn about Earth cuisine. This is military fine dining at its peak. Just wait till you try the peanut butter." Gunnar, who was quietly working on his own meal, looked up with a smirk. "Stop complaining. It's better than the cold rations we used to have back in the day." Derren shot him a grin, taking a large bite of his food before speaking up. Speaking of back in the day, did you happen to notice we weren't alone today? Gunnar raised an eyebrow, his attention shifting. What do you mean? Derren leaned forward, lowering his voice. We had a run-in with the NTC OPFOR earlier. They were scouting us out during the obstacle course. Didn't hit any of us, but it was a reminder that we're being watched. Karina, who had been sitting silently nearby, glanced up. I noticed the same. There were scouts around our perimeter last night too. They're good, barely made a sound, but they're there. Gunnar's gaze darkened, though he didn't seem surprised. That's part of the training. They'll keep testing us, waiting for an opening. Good thing we're giving them a show, Derren said, though his tone was more serious than usual. But it makes you wonder what they're planning next. Before anyone could respond, the crunch of boots on gravel drew their attention. Sergeant Major Kick, the rugged and imposing figure in charge of the NTC, walked into camp, his presence commanding the immediate respect of everyone there. Behind him, Eliana followed, her usual calm demeanour unshaken, though her silver eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. Good evening, Echo Division, Kick said with a grin, scanning the tired but determined faces around the fire. Heard you had an interesting day. Derren leaned back on his elbows, raising his MRE in mock salute. Just another day in paradise, Sergeant Major. Kick chuckled, shaking his head. Well, enjoy that while you can. Tomorrow's going to be even more fun. Gunnar gave Kick a knowing look. What's the next challenge? Eliana stepped forward, her voice soft but firm as she explained. Tomorrow you'll be making a 20-mile hike to your next campsite. Derren's mouth dropped open in exaggerated shock. Wait, on foot? Kick nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. That's right, Derren. No Wolfmobile tomorrow. No bikes, no tricks. Just you, your team, and the trail. You'll be navigating through rough terrain, and the OPFOR will be watching. Stay sharp. Clara, seated next to Omega, gave a small nod. We'll manage. Derren, still trying to recover from the idea of walking 20 miles, shook his head in disbelief. But why on foot? We've got perfectly good bikes and transportation. He glanced over at the Wolfmobile, parked not far from their camp. Kick's grin widened. Because this isn't about getting there fast, Derren. It's about endurance, teamwork, and learning to rely on each other when the terrain works against you. Gunnar gave Derren a sidelong look. You complaining already? It's just a walk. Yeah, sure, Derren muttered, sitting back with a defeated expression. Just a 20-mile walk? No big deal. Eliana turned to the group, her eyes lingering on each of them. This will be a test of your unity and strength as a team. Tomorrow isn't just about who gets there first. It's about how you work together and how you handle the unexpected. And trust me, there will be plenty of that. Derren groaned, rubbing his face. Fantastic. I'll make sure to pack extra sarcasm. Omega, still eyeing Derren with his usual distaste, let out a low growl. Derren glanced at the wolf and sighed. Oh, great. Looks like Furball here is ready to help me pack my sarcasm into a body bag. Clara chuckled, scratching Omega behind the ears. You'll be fine, Derren. Just try not to get yourself eaten before we reach the campsite. Kick gave the team one last look before heading off into the night, leaving Eliana behind. Rest up, Kick called over his shoulder. Tomorrow's going to test all of you. As the campfire crackled and the team settled in for the night, Derren couldn't help but mutter under his breath. 20 miles on foot? You've got to be kidding me, Gunnar chuckled, stretching his legs out and adjusting his mechanical arm. You wanted war games, Derren. This is just the start. Derren smirked, leaning back against his pack. Yeah. Just don't expect me to carry you, old man. The fire burned low as the teams fell into a comfortable silence, mentally preparing for the challenge that awaited them in the morning. The cool desert air was still when the OPFOR crept closer, in the dead of night. Silent shadows flitted between the tents, their footsteps barely audible as they slipped through the camp. It was a calculated maneuver, part of the NTC's game to keep both teams on edge. They moved with purpose, targeting one tent in particular, Derren's. With a few deft strokes, one of the OP4 soldiers scrawled a message in bold white chalk across the side of Derren's tent. Their silent work done, the team slipped back into the night as stealthily as they had come. When the sun rose over the desert, the camp slowly stirred to life. Derren, as usual, was the last one up, grumbling as he crawled out of his tent, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The others were already packing up, but his attention was quickly drawn to the muffled chuckles coming from Eli, Clara, and Karina. They were gathered near his tent, trying to stifle their laughter. "What's so funny?" Derren asked, clearly not amused. Clara pointed to the side of his tent, where the bold white message stood out. "We're watching you." Derren's face twisted in mock horror. "Very funny. So now they're pulling pranks on us. Great. Next thing you know, they'll be setting up whoopee cushions under my seat." Eli smirked, crossing her arms. "Maybe they're just letting you know they're in control, Derren." He scratched his head, looking at the message. "I knew we were being watched, but this is ridiculous." Before anyone could respond, Sergeant Major Kick arrived in camp, his usual confident swagger in full force. His sharp eyes scanned the group before settling on the Wolfmobile, sitting proudly near the edge of camp. "Morning, Echo Division," Kick greeted, though there was an obvious gleam of amusement in his eyes. "Mind if I borrow the keys to this fine piece of equipment?" He pointed to the Wolfmobile. "Heard a lot about it. Figured I'd take it for a test drive while you lot hoof it." Derren's face fell, and he fumbled for the keys in his pocket, grumbling as he handed them over. "Take care of her, Sarge. She's special." Kick grinned, twirling the keys. "Don't worry, Derren. I'll take real good care of your baby." With that, Kick hopped into the Wolfmobile and, with a roar of its engine, sped off into the desert, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. "Well, there goes our ride," Derren muttered, shaking his head. "I guess it's all on foot from here." Gunner clapped him on the back with a smirk. "You'll live, Derren. Time to get moving." The sun was already high in the sky as the team started their 20-mile road march. The heat beat down on them relentlessly, making the trek even more grueling. Each team had split off to their separate routes, winding through rough terrain and open stretches of desert. The packs on their backs felt heavier with every step, and the pace they set was grueling. But it wasn't just the heat and the distance that made things difficult. Along the way, the OP4 had left their mark. The first sign of trouble came when Omega suddenly stopped, growling low as he sniffed the ground. Clara knelt next to him, her sharp eyes scanning the area. "Trap," she muttered, pointing out the faint wire hidden beneath a thin layer of sand. "Looks like the OP4 laid a few surprises for us." Derren knelt beside her, inspecting the trap. "What is it?" "Nothing lethal," Clara replied, "but it'll definitely ruin your day if you step on it." Gunner barked orders to the team to stay sharp. They navigated around the trap carefully, but it wasn't the only one. Every few miles, the OP4 had left other distractions and hazards: pressure plates, false trails, and even dummy mines meant to slow them down. Halfway through the march, the team hit another challenge, a stretch of open desert completely exposed. It was the perfect place for an ambush. They moved cautiously, but just as they were halfway across, a loud boom echoed through the air. "Incoming!" Karina shouted, throwing herself to the ground as simulated explosions went off around them. Smoke filled the air and the team scrambled for cover behind rocks and bushes. It was clear the OP4 was testing them, forcing them to adapt under fire. "Nice try!" Derren yelled over the noise, firing off a few non-lethal training shots at the hidden OP4 positions, though they quickly faded back into the landscape. After the smoke cleared, they continued the march, weary but still determined. Each step felt heavier, the desert stretching endlessly in front of them. By the time they neared the new campsite, it had been 6 hours of constant walking, traps, and distractions. The new campsite was a welcome sight when they finally arrived. The team was exhausted, their bodies aching from the relentless march. As they dropped their packs and started to set up camp, there was little conversation, just the sound of tents being assembled and canteens being emptied. Derren flopped onto the ground, staring up at the sky. 20 miles. No big deal, right? Stop complaining, Clara shot back, though she was clearly just as tired. Eli stretched her arms, her face flushed from the heat. At least we made it in one piece. Gunnar, though tired, immediately started helping Karina and the others set up camp. His new arm, though powerful, had its limitations, and he was forced to rely more on his team to help him navigate the rough terrain. As they settled in, Jewel arrived at the campsite, her presence a welcome relief. She moved from person to person, checking vitals, hydration levels, and making sure no one had suffered any injuries during the march. "Looks like you all made it through," Jewel said, smiling as she packed away her medical kit. "How's everyone feeling?" "Tired," Derren answered, sitting up. "And hungry. Again." Jewel handed him a fresh bottle of water. "Rest up, you've got more to go tomorrow." The team groaned in unison, but the mood was lightened by the familiar routine of their camp. As the sun set, they gathered once more around the campfire, eating another round of MREs in relative silence, though Derren's complaints about the food never stopped. Just before they settled in for the night, Gunnar sat beside Derren, keeping his voice low. "You think the OPFOR is done messing with us?" Derren shook his head, a grin on his face. "Nah, they're just getting started. Tomorrow's going to be fun." With the next leg of the training looming, the team prepared for another night of restless sleep, knowing full well the OPFOR would be watching their every move. In the stillness of the desert night, with only the soft rustling of tents and the distant howl of wind, the camp of Echo Division slept. Exhausted from the grueling 20-mile march, everyone had finally settled into their makeshift beds. The cool breeze provided a momentary respite from the heat of the day, and for a brief moment peace seemed to settle over the camp. But then, boom! A loud explosion shattered the silence, followed by the rapid staccato of automatic gunfire. The sound came from the north side of the camp, and within seconds, the entire team was on high alert. Tents rustled as team members scrambled out of their sleeping bags, grabbing weapons and rushing toward the source of the noise. Gunnar was already halfway to the north perimeter, his mechanical arm humming as he hefted Starbreaker. Behind him, Derren, Karina, Eli, and Clara were right on his heels, ready to engage whatever threat had broken their rest. "OPFOR," Gunnar growled, knowing immediately that this was another move by the NTC's opposition force. "They're testing us again." As they reached the north side, they saw the source of the chaos. Several OPFOR soldiers, in their night vision gear, had breached the perimeter. Gunfire blazed through the night as the Echo Division team returned fire with their training rounds, their shots lighting up the desert in flashes of neon blue and red. Derren ducked behind a large boulder, firing off shots as he glanced over at Eli, who had taken cover near a pile of sandbags. "They're pushing hard!" Derren shouted. "What the hell are they up to?" Eli, calm and precise, took aim and eliminated one of the OPFOR soldiers with a well-placed shot. "Feels like a diversion." "Then what's the real target?" Derren muttered to himself as he ducked back out to fire again. As if answering his question, the unmistakable roar of the Wolfmobile's engine echoed through the night. Derren's eyes widened, and he swiveled around just in time to see the Wolfmobile speeding through camp, its turret-mounted minigun blazing as it sprayed the area with non-lethal training rounds. Gunnar and Derren both froze for a moment, watching in disbelief as the vehicle, their prized Wolfmobile, lit up the camp like a fireworks display, scattering their team as they dove for cover. "No," Derren muttered, horror dawning on his face. And Gunnar, meanwhile, was already charging toward the speeding vehicle, fury etched across his face. "Derren, you leave the keys in it!" Derren scrambled to his feet, holding up his hands defensively. "Nope," he grinned sheepishly, pulling the keys from his pocket and holding them up. "See, right here." Both of them turned to watch as the Wolfmobile continued its wild path out of camp, kicking up sand and dust, the turret blazing as it sped off into the desert night. At the same time, realization dawned on both of them. "Kick," they said in unison, groaning as they shook their heads. Gunner's jaw clenched. He must have made a copy when he moved it earlier. That crafty bastard. Derren scratched his head, trying to suppress a grin. Well, that's a problem. The rest of the team slowly regrouped, the immediate threat of the Op-4 fading as they pulled back, having completed their mission. The Wolfmobile was gone, now in enemy hands, or at least in Sergeant Major Kick's hands. Clara, who had been silent until now, gave Derren a pointed look. "So, the Wolfmobile is gone, and they just lit up our camp with it. What's next?" Derren sighed, tossing the keys into the air and catching them. "Guess we gotta get it back." The next morning, the team was still buzzing from the previous night's chaos. The tent with the chalk message now seemed like a light-hearted prank compared to what had just happened. SGM Kick had once again proven he was always 2 steps ahead. Gunnar and Derren met with Eliana as the sun rose, her ethereal presence as calm as ever. She raised an eyebrow as they approached her, clearly amused by the previous night's events. "So, the Wolfmobile?" she asked with a small smirk. "Is that what you're calling it?" Derren groaned. "Don't remind me. Kick has it now. Apparently making a key to it wasn't beneath him." Gunnar crossed his arms, his mechanical hand twitching slightly. "We need it back, Eliana. He's going to use it against us during today's exercise." Eliana nodded, her silver eyes gleaming with mischief. "It will be interesting to see how that plays out. I'll keep score, of course." With that settled, the teams were given their next assignment, a 20-mile foot march to the new camp, with a series of distractions set up by the Op-4 along the way. The day promised to be grueling. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Echo divisions split into their respective teams and began the trek. Gunnar, Karina, and their team were immediately cautious. The previous night had been a reminder that they were being watched, and the Op-4 would likely be even more aggressive now. Meanwhile, Derren and Eli led their team along their own route. Omega, as always, kept his distance from Derren, clearly still holding a grudge from the parachuting incident. Every time Derren tried to talk to the wolf, Omega would simply turn his head away, tail flicking in disdain. "You know," Derren said to Eli as they hiked, "I'm pretty sure your wolf still hates me." Eli chuckled softly. "He'll come around, eventually." "Right," Derren muttered. "Maybe by the time we're retired." As the teams navigated the harsh terrain, they found more signs of Op-4 activity. Tripwires were hidden along the path, and at one point Karina narrowly avoided stepping into a pitfall disguised by loose sand. The constant traps and distractions slowed them down, but by early afternoon, both teams reached their new camp, exhausted from the march. As they set up camp once again, the familiar weariness settled in. Muscles sore from the miles of walking and the tension of constantly being on alert. The camp buzzed with low conversation as the teams huddled around their MREs, the food as uninspiring as ever. Derren poked at his meal with a fork, shaking his head. "You ever notice how MREs somehow make hunger seem better?" Gunnar, sitting across from him, was quiet for a moment before leaning in. "Did you notice we were being followed?" Derren's eyes flicked up, his expression serious. "Yeah. Ran into them last night after they took the Wolfmobile." "They're not done with us yet," Gunnar added, his voice low. "Keep an eye out." Just as the tension began to rise again, SGM Kick and Eliana entered the camp. Kick, grinning like a fox, tossed Derren a mock salute. "How's it going, Echo Division?" Kick said with a smirk. "Enjoy the little surprise last night?" Derren glared at him but couldn't hide his amusement. "You really couldn't resist, could you?" Kick shrugged, completely unapologetic. "It was right there. You got to admit, the look on your face was priceless." Gunnar cut in. "When do we get it back?" Kick grinned wider. "Oh, don't worry. You'll get your chance. But for now, I've got something else to tell you. Tomorrow, You've got a 20-mile hike on foot to your next location. Both teams groaned, but there was no way around it. The challenge was clear. Another grueling march awaited them, and they had no idea what the Op4 had planned next. As the sun set, and they settled in for another night, there was an unspoken understanding between both teams. This was more than just a training exercise. It was a game of strategy, skill, and endurance. And they weren't just fighting the Op4, they were fighting for pride and bragging rights. But first, they had to survive another night in the desert. The night was unusually still, the oppressive heat of the desert replaced by a biting chill that clung to the air. Gunnar stood by the edge of the camp, staring out into the distance. He'd been on edge since the previous night, knowing the Op4 was still lurking nearby, testing their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike again. His mind churned through different strategies, but something wasn't sitting right. That's when he felt her presence beside him. Clara. Silent as ever, her eyes gleamed under the dim moonlight, and her expression was sharp, intense. She crossed her arms, standing next to him, but she wasn't here for casual conversation. "Gunnar," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with the kind of determination that signaled something was about to change. "I'm done with the defense. We've been playing their game, reacting to their moves." She turned her gaze to him, eyes hardening. "It's time to remind them who we truly are." Gunnar glanced at her, sensing the shift. This wasn't the measured, strategic Clara who usually paced their approach. This was something else, something fiercer. "We are the pack first and always," Clara continued, the conviction in her voice unwavering. "And I'm tired of letting them take the first step." Gunnar let the words sink in, his mechanical arm clenching instinctively. She was right. They'd been defensive long enough, biding their time, waiting for the Op4 to make the next move. But that wasn't how the pack operated. They were hunters, predators. They didn't hide. Clara turned slightly, her eyes shifting to Karina, who was sitting nearby sharpening her blades, quietly watching the night. "Karina," Clara called, her voice carrying a subtle challenge, "it's time for you to stop holding back. No more shadows. I need you to do what you do best. Take out our watchers." Karina's eyes flicked up, narrowing as a slow grin spread across her face. She ran her thumb along the edge of her blade, the familiar weight of it calming her nerves. "About time," she said, her voice low but laced with anticipation. "They won't even know what hit them." Clara nodded and turned toward Derren, who had been observing the conversation from the other side of the camp, always ready but rarely speaking unless necessary. "Derren," Clara said, her tone more measured but no less intense. "You know what needs to be done? Recon. They're close. Too close. Take Ashley and Beta. Find their base. It's out there, and we need eyes on it before we make our next move." Derren's golden eyes glimmered with focus as she rose to her feet, slinging her sniper rifle across her back. "Got it," she said simply, her mind already working through the best route to take. "I'll be back before dawn." Clara gestured to the rest of the team, her voice commanding but calm. "The rest of us will stay here, act like we're still hunkered down. We'll play the part, make it look like we're waiting out the night. But we'll cover Derren's team until she locates their base." As the others nodded in agreement, Gunnar finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "We strike when Derren gives us the location." Clara's eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment there was an understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that the tide was about to turn. "We strike hard, and we remind them that we're not just some team playing by the rules, we're the pack." Gunnar nodded, his resolve hardening. This was it. No more waiting. No more games. They were going to take the fight to the Op4, and they were going to show them exactly what it meant to be hunted by the pack. Karina moved like a shadow, blending seamlessly into the darkness as she slipped out of camp. The Op4 had been watching them for days now, but tonight they wouldn't see her coming. Her blades glinted faintly under the sliver of moonlight as she made her way silently through the rocky terrain. Her mission was simple: Take out the watchers. She knew they were close, tucked into the natural folds of the desert landscape, using night vision to keep tabs on Echo Division's every move. But Karina had a way of moving that defied even the most advanced surveillance. She'd been trained to disappear in plain sight, and tonight, the Op-4 was about to learn that the hard way. Desiree, Ashley, and Beta moved quickly but quietly through the desert, the sand shifting beneath their feet as they made their way toward the location Clara had suspected the Op-4 base to be. Desiree's eyes scanned the horizon, her instincts sharpened from years of recon missions. She could feel it, the subtle shifts in the terrain, the patterns of movement that suggested the Op-4 was nearby. They were getting close. "Keep low," Desiree murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. "We don't know how heavily fortified they are yet." Ashley, ever the quick shot, gripped her weapon tightly, her eyes darting around the landscape, searching for any sign of movement. Beta, the massive wolf, padded silently beside them, his ears flicking back and forth as he sniffed the air for any signs of danger. Back at camp, the rest of the team settled in, doing their best to look as though they were resting for the night. But their senses were on high alert, every member of the pack ready to move the moment Desiree gave the signal. Gunnar glanced at Clara, who was leaning against a nearby rock, her expression calm but lethal. "You think this will draw them out?" he asked quietly. Clara smirked, her eyes gleaming in the low light. "It's not about drawing them out, Gunnar, it's about hunting them down. And once Desiree finds their base, we'll show them what happens when they underestimate the pack." Hours passed, and just before dawn, Desiree's voice crackled over the comms. "We found them. Sending coordinates now." Gunnar stood, his hand gripping his rifle as the familiar rush of battle surged through his veins. He turned to the rest of the team, his voice low and steady. "Let's move." The pack was ready, and by the end of the day, the Op-4 would know exactly why they were feared. The air was cool as the sun began to peek over the horizon. Clara crouched low on the ridge, scanned the Op-4 camp through her binoculars. Below, the Wolfmobile sat proudly in the center of the camp, a symbol of the insult they'd endured the night before. The faint smell of dust and sweat lingered as the rest of her team quietly moved into position, each person more determined than ever to take back what was theirs. Clara had a fierce gleam in her eyes as she surveyed the camp. She turned to Desiree, who was already checking her sniper rifle, making sure every piece was in perfect working order. "Desiree, I want you up high. Find a perch where you can get a full view of the camp. Ashley, you're with her as a spotter. Take Bravo and stay hidden until the signal. If things go south, I want you covering our retreat." Desiree nodded, already in her element. The faintest smile tugged at the corners of her mouth as she scanned for her vantage point. "I've got it," she said, locking her gaze on a small outcropping overlooking the entire camp. Ashley knelt beside her, preparing her equipment, while Bravo, the sleek, agile wolf, was already sniffing the air, catching the faintest traces of the enemy. "Good," Clara muttered, shifting her attention to Karina. The seasoned warrior had been waiting patiently, her blades glinting faintly in the early light. "I want you to do what you do best. See if there's a way to slip Derren into that Wolfmobile. If we can get control of that minigun, we can rain hell on them before they even know what's happening." Karina grinned. She loved the challenge of infiltration, and her mind was already working on how to get close without being detected. "Consider it done. I'll have him in that thing before they even know it." Satisfied, Clara turned to Gunnar. His presence was steady, a wall of strength they all drew confidence from. His prosthetic arm gleamed in the low light, a reminder of both his loss and his resilience. "What do you want me doing?" Gunnar asked, his voice low but eager for action. Clara gave him a hard look, one of trust and pride. "You're with me, Alpha 2. We're going into the heart of this. I want the command tent taken out and their communications severed. Once we hit them hard, they'll scatter. When they do, I want you to be the hammer that drives them into the ground. Gunnar nodded, a wolfish grin appearing as he glanced down at Alpha, the massive dire wolf standing at his side, ready for the hunt. Let's give them something to remember. Finally, Clara turned to Eli, who had been silently prepping her gear, her magical aura calm but sharp. Eli, I want traps set in the ravine. That's the best cover for them if they try to retreat. Make sure it's hell for them to get through. Eli gave a brief nod, her eyes already glowing faintly as she activated a small device in her hand. They won't make it far, she said confidently, knowing her magic-infused gadgets would create just the distraction they needed. Clara gave one last look around, checking on each member of the team. Her heart swelled with pride. They were more than a team. They were the pack. And now it was time to show these interlopers exactly what that meant. Everyone get into position. When you're set, let me know. I'll be the distraction with Omega. Once I draw them out, Derren, I want you to unleash hell with that minigun. Let's take our camp back. The minutes ticked by in silence as the team moved into position. Karina slipped into the shadows like a ghost, her movements almost imperceptible as she neared the Wolfmobile. Desera and Ashley, accompanied by Bravo, had already taken their sniper position high above the camp, the scope of Desera's rifle trained on the command tent, ready to eliminate any high-value targets that might emerge. Clara crouched behind a rocky outcrop with Omega at her side, the massive half-dire wolf, half-grey wolf panting softly, his eyes trained on the camp like a predator stalking its prey. Desera in position, came the soft whisper over the comms. Karina ready? Another voice crackled quietly in Clara's ear. Clara took a deep breath. Everything was set. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the camp. The Op-4 was still emerging from their tents, groggy and unaware of the ambush that was about to unfold. All right, let's do this, Clara whispered. With a quick motion, she and Omega stepped out from their cover, walking directly into the open. The two of them moved with a casual air, just enough to catch the attention of the few Op-4 soldiers on guard. Almost immediately, there was a stir of confusion in the camp. That's the signal, Derren muttered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the Op-4 scramble to react. He crouched low, using Karina's cover to slip into the Wolfmobile, unnoticed. As soon as he was behind the turret, a grin spread across his face. The minigun hummed to life under his fingertips. Time to play, Derren whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. In a burst of gunfire, the Wolfmobile's minigun roared to life, spraying non-lethal rounds in a hail of firepower. The sound was deafening, and the camp erupted into chaos as Op-4 soldiers dove for cover. The minigun shredded through tents and gear, forcing the Op-4 into a desperate scramble. Some tried to return fire, but they were completely outgunned. Derren's aim was precise, his grin widening as he enjoyed the upper hand. Come on! You wanted a fight! He shouted over the roar of the gun. Let's see what you've got! The Op-4 scattered, just as Clara had predicted. Soldiers sprinted toward the ravine, seeking cover from the relentless assault. But Eli had anticipated this. The moment the first group of soldiers reached the ravine, her traps activated. A series of magical tripwires detonated, sending sparks of energy through the air, disorienting the soldiers and forcing them back into the open. Perfect, Eli muttered from her hidden position, watching the chaos unfold with satisfaction. Meanwhile, Gunnar and Alpha had slipped into the camp's center during the confusion. They quickly approached the command tent, where the Op-4's communications system was housed. Take out their comms and they're done, Gunnar whispered to Alpha. The massive wolf leaped forward, tearing through the tent's entrance with a powerful swipe. Gunnar followed, his prosthetic arm whirring as he crushed the radio equipment underfoot, severing the Op-4's ability to coordinate. We're in, Gunnar reported over the comms. Comms are down. With their communications destroyed and their forces in disarray, the Op-4 had no choice but to fall back. Clara watched as the last few soldiers began retreating toward the ravine, exactly where they wanted them. "Everyone converge on the ravine," Clara ordered. "We're finishing this." As the team moved in, Desiree called out from her sniper perch. "I've got eyes on the last group. They're pinned, but they've still got fight left in them." "Let's end it," Clara said, her voice full of confidence. Derren, still manning the Wolfmobile, grinned. "Time to bring out the big guns." With a final burst from the minigun, Derren obliterated the last remaining pockets of resistance, forcing the OPFOR into complete retreat. As the dust settled, Aliana, Jewel, and Sergeant Major Kick watched from their vantage point on the nearby cliff, observing the entire battle with interest. "Looks like they've got this one wrapped up," Aliana remarked, a slight smile on her lips. "Yeah, but don't tell them that," Kick said with a laugh. "I've still got a few tricks up my sleeve." Down below, the team regrouped at the center of the camp, the Wolfmobile parked triumphantly behind them. Gunnar shook his head, staring at the damage the minigun had caused. "You really enjoyed that, didn't you?" Gunnar asked, looking over at Derren. Derren shrugged, tossing the keys to the Wolfmobile in the air and catching them again. "Maybe a little." The team shared a collective laugh, their victory sealed. But as they gathered around for one final meal of MREs, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. They had earned every bit of their bragging rights. As the dust settled on the battlefield, the familiar figure of Sergeant Major Keek, accompanied by Aliana and Jewel, descended from their vantage point. The Sergeant Major, a seasoned warrior who had overseen countless training exercises, raised his hand to his radio and calmly called into the receiver. "Endex, end of exercise," Kick's voice echoed through the air, the signal marking the conclusion of the wargame. He approached Gunnar and the rest of the pack, his stern expression betraying a hint of approval as he surveyed the scene of their victory. "Good job, Gunnar," Kick said with a nod. "You and your team put on one hell of a show." The OPFOR team, now returning from the ravine and the wreckage of their camp, began to gather around. The soldiers, still in awe of the battle they'd just experienced, stood silently as they gazed at the large wolves, Alpha, Omega, and Bravo, who loomed over the scene, their presence both intimidating and majestic. The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the sheer power and discipline of the pack. Gunnar, wiping the sweat from his brow, stepped forward to address the group. His eyes scanned the soldiers, his voice calm but commanding. "Listen up, all of you. What you've seen here today is classified. The team you faced, and everything you witnessed, needs to remain a secret. This operation and the existence of my team are not to be discussed outside this group." As he spoke, a ripple of understanding passed through the gathered soldiers. They knew they had seen something extraordinary, something that went far beyond the bounds of a normal training exercise. There was no protest, no need for further explanation, just quiet nods of agreement as they understood the gravity of the situation. From the back of the group, a female voice called out confidently, "No problem, sir." Gunnar paused, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He knew that voice. He turned to see Reagan Hayes, a figure from his past, stepping forward through the crowd. Her presence felt like a jolt of nostalgia mixed with a wave of pride. She now wore the rank of lieutenant colonel, her uniform crisp, but her smile familiar. "Reagan," Gunnar said, his voice softening as he walked toward her. Reagan Hayes had been an integral part of the old agency, working closely with Gunnar, Jewel, Ashley, and Clara. She had been a liaison to the army and one of the few people who truly understood the nature of their work. After the downfall of the agency, she had been reassigned, but seeing her now, it was clear that time hadn't dulled their connection. Gunnar enveloped her in a hug, a rare display of emotion. She hugged him back tightly, the bond between them evident. "It's good to see you, Gunnar," Reagan said warmly, her voice carrying a sense of familiarity and loyalty. Jewel and Ashley, standing nearby, shared in the moment, both of them stepping forward to greet Reagan with hugs of their own. The years of working together had forged strong ties, and seeing her again felt like a reunion of sorts, a reminder of the battles they'd fought side by side. "Lieutenant Colonel, huh?" Jewel teased, looking at Reagan's new rank with a smirk. "Moving up in the world, I see." Ashley chimed in, her eyes bright with recognition. "It's been too long, Reagan. Feels like old times." Clara stepped forward too, offering a nod of respect to Reagan. Though Clara had taken on a leadership role in the pack, she recognized the importance of Reagan's past contributions. Reagan had been instrumental in keeping the military and the agency aligned during those chaotic years, and her presence here now, though unexpected, felt like a missing piece falling back into place. Reagan grinned, glancing down at her new insignia. "Well, somebody has to keep things running smoothly out here, and it looks like you all haven't changed much. Still out here kicking ass and taking names." Gunnar chuckled, crossing his arms. "You know us. Can't stay out of trouble for too long." The mood was light, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness as the group gathered around. The Op-Force soldiers, though fascinated by the reunion, were clearly ready to move out, giving the team space to talk amongst themselves. Sergeant Major Keek, watching from the side, stepped forward. "All right, people, you've all seen enough for today. Get yourselves squared away and head back to the barracks. You'll debrief tomorrow." He gave a sharp nod to the soldiers, who saluted and began to file out. As the soldiers departed, Eliana stepped closer, her silver eyes observing the reunion with quiet wisdom. "It seems old bonds run deep," she said, her voice carrying a subtle weight. Gunnar nodded, his eyes still on Reagan. "They do, and we're going to need those bonds if we're going to get through what's coming." The group stood in the cool evening air, the sun beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the training grounds. With the exercise officially over, they took a moment to reflect, not just on the day's victory, but on the bigger picture. There were still many battles to fight, and though this had been a training exercise, it was a reminder of how much stronger they were together. "All right," Gunnar said, breaking the silence. "Let's head back to camp and get ready for whatever comes next. But first..." He turned back to Reagan, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "What brings you here, Reagan? I can't imagine you're just passing through." Reagan smiled knowingly. "Let's just say there's more to discuss than just old times, Gunnar. But we'll get to that soon enough." With that, the team, reunited with an old friend and strengthened by the day's exercise, made their way back to camp. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, of more to come, but for now they savoured the rare moment of victory and camaraderie. The sun hung low over the horizon as Gunnar's team loaded up the black jet. The week of intense training had taken its toll, but there was a sense of satisfaction among them. They had pushed their limits, grown closer, and learned more about how far they could go as a team. The sleek black jet was waiting, engines humming softly, as Ashley, Beta, Alpha, Karina, and Desiree carried their gear on board. Nearby, Reagan Hayes, now donning the insignia of a lieutenant colonel, approached the group with her usual confident stride. Gunnar glanced up, spotting her through the haze of exhaustion, but managing a small smile. Reagan had been a trusted ally in the past, and seeing her now stirred memories of the old days. "Mind if I hitch a ride?" Reagan asked, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. "I've got some things I want to run by you, Gunnar." "Always room for you, Reagan," Gunnar replied, gesturing toward the jet's ramp. As the others loaded up their gear, Reagan stepped up beside Gunnar, keeping her voice low. "I thought you'd like to know Sophia took the Homeland Security gig. She's going to be running the new Supernatural Threat Division." Gunnar raised an eyebrow. "That's a hell of a job." Reagan nodded. "It is, and she's going to need some help. She asked me to join her. We're putting together a team, but that's not all." Gunnar stopped, turning to face her fully. "What else?" Reagan gave him a serious look, her tone softening. "Sophia wants Echo Division, as an off-the-books asset. No names, no records, just a number. She's thinking asset number 1. You'd be working behind the scenes, but officially, you wouldn't exist." Gunnar crossed his arms, considering the weight of the proposal. That's a big ask. My team's been through a lot, Reagan. I'll have to talk it over with them. I get that, Reagan replied. But think about it. You'd still have the freedom to operate the way you do now, but with Homeland Security backing you up when it matters. Gunnar nodded. I'll think on it. Let's see what the others have to say. Meanwhile, across the airfield, Derren and his team were making their own preparations. The Chinook helicopter hovered overhead, kicking up dust and debris as it slowly lowered itself to the ground. Derren had a wide grin plastered across his face as he drove the Wolfmobile up into the cargo bay, the sleek, customized vehicle gleaming under the midday sun. Omega trotted beside the vehicle, eyeing Derren with an expression that clearly said he still wasn't over the parachuting incident. As Derren parked the Wolfmobile, he glanced at Omega, grinning mischievously. I'm telling you, bud, next time it'll be your turn to drive. Omega's only response was a low growl as he climbed aboard, settling in with Clara and Eli in the back. Derren walked around to the pilot's seat, checking the controls, while Eli buckled herself in, still tinkering with some gadgets she had salvaged from the week's exercises. You know, Derren said over his shoulder, when we get back to the workshop, I was thinking, maybe you could work your magic on the Wolfmobile, Eli. Give it some upgrades. Eli, without looking up, sighed. Derren, I'm more concerned about the minigun on top of that thing. The ammo consumption is insane. I can't keep hand-carving runes into each round. It would take me a week just to make enough for 1 minute of fire. Derren's face fell. You mean we can't use the minigun as much? Not unless you want to run out of ammo in 30 seconds, Eli replied flatly. She looked up from her tools, meeting his eyes. Honestly, you should have thought about this before slapping a rune-enchanted gun on top of a vehicle. Yeah, but it looks cool, Derren said defensively. And come on, think of the firepower. Clara chuckled from the back, shaking her head. You and your toys, Derren. As the banter between the team continued, Omega settled down on the floor of the cargo bay, eyeing Derren warily every time the man glanced his way. Clearly, the half-dire wolf hadn't forgiven him for the parachuting debacle earlier in the week. Don't worry, Omega, Derren said with a smirk. I'll make it up to you. Maybe some treats when we get back? Omega snorted and turned his head away, refusing to acknowledge the peace offering. The Chinook's rotors thrummed overhead as they lifted off the ground and soared toward the airfield where the black C-130 was waiting to take them the rest of the way back to Traverse City. The flight was uneventful, save for the continued banter between Derren and Omega, which had by now devolved into a running gag between the rest of the team. Derren glanced at Omega as the large wolf pretended to ignore him. You know, Omega, if you ever want driving lessons, just let me know. Omega's only response was a low growl, but Derren swore he saw a glimmer of amusement in the wolf's eyes. Let it go, Derren, Eli said with a smirk, not even looking up from her work. You're never going to win him over. You underestimate my charm, Derren replied with a grin. Clara rolled her eyes. Yeah, that's worked so well with the wolf so far. After a smooth flight aboard the C-130, the team touched down at the small airfield near Traverse City. The large doors to the workshop were already open, and as the Wolfmobile roared up the gravel driveway, the rest of the team was already there waiting. Gunner's team had arrived only minutes earlier, unloading gear and preparing for a well-deserved rest. Karina, and Ashley were standing nearby, chatting about the week's exercises. Reagan, standing beside Gunner, offered a small wave as Derren drove the Wolfmobile into the workshop, parking it with a satisfied grin. As the teams began to settle back in, the tension of the week's competitive war games dissolved into laughter and camaraderie once more. Well, I think that's a wrap, Gunner said, looking around at his team with pride. Hell of a week, people. Derren nodded in agreement, clapping Gunner on the back. So, who's buying drinks tonight? I think you owe us after that ambush, Karina chimed in with a grin. All right, Derren conceded. Drinks on me! As the team laughed and began unloading gear, there was a sense of shared victory in the air. They had all faced challenges, both physical and mental, and come out stronger for it. The end of their week-long exercise had brought them closer, but as Gunnar considered Reagan's proposition from earlier, he knew they had more difficult choices ahead. He would have to talk it over with the team, but deep down, he already knew what his answer would be. Echo Division was more than a team. It was a family. And no matter what the world threw at them next, they would face it together. After a couple of days to decompress, the team was gradually drawn back to the rhythm of the workshop. Each member had taken the time to recover and reflect on their experiences during the recent training at the NTC. The atmosphere was a mixture of ease and anticipation. While the team was enjoying their well-deserved downtime, they knew Gunnar had called a meeting. The Homeland Security offer hung heavily in the air, and today they would finally address it. They gathered in the main briefing room, a space lined with old maps, tactical gear, and ancient texts, blending the old-world mystique with cutting-edge technology. Gunnar, leaning against the long metal table in the center of the room, waited as everyone took their seats. His expression was thoughtful, but his eyes held that familiar intensity. Reagan had briefed him on the offer, but now it was time to get the input from the entire Echo Division. Once everyone was settled, Gunnar spoke, his tone steady and direct. "All right, team. We've been offered an opportunity to work with Homeland Security, but there's a catch. We won't be officially acknowledged or protected. We'll be operating as an off-the-books asset. Asset number 1, they're calling us. That means no backup, no public recognition, and if anything goes sideways, we're on our own. Before I make any decisions, I want to hear your thoughts." Derren was the first to speak up, his tone skeptical. "So, let me get this straight. They want us to handle their dirty work without giving us any official support. That sounds like they're using us as a failsafe. If something goes wrong, they can just walk away and leave us to deal with the mess." Karina nodded, crossing her arms. "I have to agree with Derren. It sounds like they want us as expendable assets. We've fought hard to establish ourselves as something more than that. I don't like the idea of being a ghost team with no rights and no protection." Clara leaned forward, her expression intense but conflicted. "I see where you're both coming from, but think about the alternative. Without us, they'll use some other team that won't know what they're doing. If we're involved, we can control the narrative and ensure the right people are protected. We'd be doing the world a service." Eli, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "I agree with Clara. As much as I hate the idea of working off the grid, it might be our only shot at keeping the supernatural world contained. If we say no, they'll find someone else, someone less experienced, more dangerous. We can't let amateurs handle this." DeSera nodded, considering Eli's words. "It's true. We're the best at what we do, and we know how to deal with supernatural threats without making things worse. But it would mean constantly looking over our shoulders. We'd have no backup and no safety net." There was a pause as everyone absorbed the implications. Gunnar watched each of them, noting their reactions before he continued. "This isn't just about our team. It's about protecting innocent lives. That's always been our mission, whether we had a badge or not. But accepting this deal also means we'll be putting ourselves at even greater risk. If we go rogue in their eyes, we're all expendable." Omega let out a low growl, as if sensing the tension, and Clara placed a calming hand on his fur. She looked back at Gunnar, eyes firm. "We've never been the kind to back down from a fight. But if we do this, we have to make sure we're prepared for the worst. We need an emergency plan. A way out if things go south." Derren leaned back, crossing his arms with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll definitely need more resources, that's for sure. I'm talking weapons, safe houses, anything that can give us a fighting chance. If we're going to be on our own, we need to be ready for anything." Reagan, who had been standing quietly near the door, stepped forward. "If you agree to this, I can help make sure you get the resources you need. Sophia and I have connections within Homeland Security, and we can provide intel. I won't let them hang you out to dry. Not if I can help it. No. Gunnar nodded, glancing at her before addressing the team again. This decision isn't mine alone. We all have a say here. If even one of us is unwilling, we won't do it. But if we do agree, we do it together, knowing the risks and preparing for the worst. A silence settled over the room as each member weighed the choice. Finally, Eli broke the quiet, her gaze steady as she looked at each of them. We've faced death before. We've operated in the shadows. I'm in. One by one, the others nodded in agreement, a mix of resolve and trepidation on their faces. Derren was the last to respond, sighing heavily before he shrugged. Looks like I'm in too. Let's do this then. Just make sure we're ready to hit back if they cross us. Gunnar straightened, a slight smile on his lips as he took in his team's decision. Then it's settled. We'll be asset number 1, but we're doing this on our terms. Reagan, let them know we'll accept, but only if they meet our conditions. We need full autonomy, resources, and the freedom to pull out if they compromise us. Reagan nodded, her expression serious. Understood. I'll take care of it. And remember, you've got allies on the inside. I'll make sure you have what you need. With the decision made, Gunnar dismissed the team, a sense of purpose settling over them as they prepared to take on this new chapter. They knew the risks, but they had each other, and that was enough. As they left the room, each one understood that Echo Division was more than a team. They were a family, ready to face whatever came their way, together.
Well, you found your way to the end, haven't you? That must mean you're curious, and we love curiosity around here. Before you vanish into the ether, take a moment to subscribe. It's just a click, and trust me, you'll want to stay in the loop for what comes next. And while you're at it, give the video a like. The energy exchange is good for you. Hit that notification bell too. You wouldn't want to miss out on any of our magical misadventures. Who knows what I might conjure up next. Alright, off you go. But remember, I'll know if you didn't subscribe. See you on the other side.